The engineering log of Quelanath, first engineer, Endless Meridian, had been kept in the same format for 3 years and 4 months. Date header, ship status summary, systems notation, action record, projected outcomes. She had written it in the same precise script every night regardless of the hour, regardless of what the day had produced. Because the log was the record and the record was the discipline and the discipline was, in the absence of solutions, the thing she could maintain. She had never used the notes field. The notes field was for anomalies, circumstances outside the standard documentation structure. In 3 years of crisis, she had produced 4,012 pages of technical documentation, a root cause analysis that her colleagues called a masterwork, and 17 distinct active failure reports written with a precision that was, by any measure, extraordinary. All of it fit within the standard structure. The situation, however catastrophic, was documentable. She was beginning to suspect that the next 10 days would not be. The human arrived missing his left boot. This was the first thing Quelanath noticed, because she noticed things in order of anomaly. And a being who had traveled across 18 days of space in the company of a merchant crew and arrived at a formal docking, proceeding with one boot, was an anomaly of some significance. He did not appear troubled by it. He appeared troubled by the deck plating. He looked down at it when he stepped through the port, assessed it with a specificity that suggested he was checking something, and then looked up at her with a particular expression of someone who has decided to operate with incomplete information and is cataloging which gaps to monitor. She had prepared 63 slides. Corporal Adeyemi's report mentioned cascading failure across 17 distinct systems, he said, before she could begin. His name was Marcus Webb. His file said age 52, former chief engineer and voluntary separation in the circumstances column, which was not what voluntary separation looked like in practice, and which she had noted before his arrival. Can I see the engine room? The briefing will contextualize. I'm sure it will. Can I see the engine room? She chose her battles. She took him to the engine room. He stood in the doorway for a moment before entering. Then he inhaled, a long, deliberate breath through what she understood to be his primary olfactory organ, his nose, held for a second, processed. He walked to the primary coupling interface without looking at the instrument panels. He crouched. He placed his ungloved hand flat on the housing, the full palm, fingers spread, and he listened. Not with his auditory organs, which were on the sides of his head, but with something that operated through his hands. His eyes closed for approximately 4 seconds. He stood up. "Oh," he said. "I've seen this before," she said. "Precisely. You have seen a Class 7 Salathi generation ship and cascading multi-system failure before." "Not exactly this," he said. He was already reaching into his bag. Close enough. He had a tool in his hand. She could not immediately identify its category, and he was looking not at the primary coupling but at the secondary loop access panel. Who has the best hands-on time with the secondary loop? Not who reads the data, who's physically been working on it. Her filaments lifted. She was aware of this and would have suppressed it if she had been faster, but the question arrived before her composure did. It was not the question the briefing was designed to answer. She had 63 slides about system interactions, model predictions, cascade chronology, and intervention points, and the question Marcus Webb had asked in the first 4 minutes was, "Who has spent the most time touching this thing?" She answered it. She said an X name. The dynamic had shifted before she had words to describe the shift. The briefing happened on day 2. Quelanath delivered it with the precision she applied to all formal presentations, each slide complete, each data set contextualized. The priority hierarchy she had spent 2 days constructing fully legible in the materials. Marcus Webb sat across from her and was, she noted with some surprise, an attentive audience. He did not appear impatient. He asked questions. The questions were not what she expected. The pressure differential. When your team first flagged it, what did the room smell like? She stopped. That wasn't recorded. Before the automated systems responded to the harmonic resonance. Was there a sound change? Anything your engineers noted in the secondary loop area? The instrument readings indicated. I know what the instruments said. Did anyone notice anything with their ears? She reviewed the documentation in her memory with a speed and completeness that was a genuine Salafi advantage in situations like this. 4,000 pages. She found nothing. Instrument readings, model outputs, intervention logs. No record of what any engineer had heard, smelled, or felt with their hands. Because those were not categories of data. They were not data. They were the subjective experiences of engineers who were trained to look at instruments. That evening, she sat for a long time before writing her log entry. When she wrote it, the last sentence read, "Webb's questions reveal a category of data I did not collect because I did not know it was data." She looked at the sentence. She filed the log. She did not sleep well. The first repair was on day 1, but she understood it on day 2, after the briefing, when the thermal exchange at Junction 7 settled exactly as Marcus had said it would, without the 2 cascade effects her model had predicted. She read her notes twice. She added one line, "Repair outcome inconsistent with model prediction. Outcome better than predicted. No current explanation." Her intellectual honesty was, she considered, both her greatest professional asset and the most uncomfortable feature of her personality to actually possess. It would not let her dismiss the result. It required her to hold the result alongside her model, and her model had no space for it, and the gap between them was now a documented anomaly that she was going to have to think about. On day 4, she had to think about it faster than she would have preferred. Marcus proposed a repair to the atmospheric processor junction. Her model said 73% probability of cascade into the primary water reclamation system. She presented this clearly with documentation, because she was a thorough professional and he was a guest engineer who had been on the ship for 4 days, and it was her ship and her responsibility and 4,000 people. He listened. He said, "Your model's working from spec tolerances?" "Yes." "The junction's not at spec." He looked at it, not at the readings, at the physical object. "It's been off spec for a while. Your 73% is for a different machine. The tolerances are the tolerances, I know." And then he reached out and took her hand. The contact was unexpected enough that she didn't pull back. And then she didn't pull back because she was paying attention to what was happening. He placed her palm flat against the junction housing. "What do you feel?" She felt a vibration. She said so. "What's it doing?" She listened with her hand, and she found that she could, which was not something she had known about herself before this moment. The vibration had a pattern, not the regular cycling of a functioning system, and not the arrhythmia of a failed one. Something between, a rhythm that was compensating for something, adjusting and readjusting in a loop that had become habitual. She said, "Cycling. Irregular. It's adjusting, compensating," he said. "It's been doing it about 8 months, based on the wear, developed its own response to the pressure variance. Your model doesn't know this rhythm exists, because your sensors measure output, not behavior. I'm not repairing the spec junction. I'm repairing this junction." He did the repair. The water reclamation system was unaffected. She stood in the engine room after he moved on, and she put her hand flat on the junction housing again, and she felt steady. The compensatory rhythm was gone. The junction was not at spec in the way the document described, but it was. She searched for the word and found only a word her training did not authorize as a technical term, settled. She wrote the instrument readings in her log. She did not write the other thing. She was not ready to write the other thing. On day 5, Marcus's thermos ran out. She took him to the crew galley. The closest Slavi equivalent to his coffee was setka, a warm preparation with a caffeine-bearing compound and a flavor profile that Marcus, on his first sip, described as if coffee had an opinion about itself. "It's not bad," he said. "It is not coffee," Quelanath said. "No." He took another sip. He had one standard human work boot and one boot that the Meridian's fabrication system had produced a functional specification from her description, which was a description derived from the original boot's measurements rather than any first-hand encounter with human footwear. And the result was something that was technically a boot by every structural criterion and that Marcus wore without complaint because it was a boot, and there was work to do. He looked entirely comfortable in the crew galley with his mismatched boots and his alien beverage, asking Anek about her engineering qualifying examinations. Anek, who had been nervous around him for 4 days in a way she couldn't articulate, the nervousness of someone watching a person work in a way that did not match any training she had received, and not yet knowing if this was because the person was very good or because the person was wrong. Was, Quelanath noticed, no longer nervous. She was talking about her examination process, and Marcus was asking about the practical component, and the galley had taken on the quality of a room where people were simply, without agenda, talking. Quelanath watched him drink setka and talk to Anek about qualifying exams and look entirely, unreservedly at home, and she became aware that her model of him, human generalist, limited application, assess and recalibrate, was not the correct model and had not been the correct model since the thermal exchange settled at Junction 7 on day 2 and possibly before. He was not a generalist deployed outside his domain. He was precisely in his domain. The domain was not functional ships. The domain was this: broken systems, frightened engineers, problems that had left the predictive literature behind. He lived here. She had been watching him be at home in her crisis and had filed it incorrectly. She asked about the photograph. "Kevin?" he said. "Who is Kevin?" "My sister's dog." "Good dog." Very opinionated about squirrels. His voice did something when he said it, a warmth that she had not heard him direct at any object or person so far. She noted it. Significant affective marker. Function unclear, she wrote in her log that night. She sat with the entry for longer than it warranted. Day 6. She realized he was narrating. She had heard it before and logged it as idiosyncrasy of human professional culture, apparent self-directed vocalization during task execution, and moved on, because there was always something more urgent to document. Today she stopped moving and listened. He was working on the tertiary power distribution grid, the third most complex active failure, which he had been approaching from the outside in, addressing surrounding systems first with a methodology she had been following without fully understanding. He was talking to the grid, not to Anek, who was assisting on the secondary coupling access, to the grid itself. "You've been pulling from the secondary because the primary gave you a scare," he said, adjusting something she couldn't see from her position, his voice the same register as if he were explaining something to a student. "I know, but the primary's not going anywhere now. Here, I'm going to make it easy for you to go back. You don't have to hold this much on your own." She stood very still. She reached for her personal recorder. She began to transcribe verbatim. She did this for 40 minutes. When she played it back that evening, she had something she had not expected: an engineering document. Not in any format she had encountered. No model notation, no tolerance specifications, no instrument references, but embedded in the narrative, in the casual, unhurried voice of a man explaining to a machine what was wrong with it and what he was going to do about it, was a real-time diagnostic record of the system interaction that she could not have, generated from her sensors alone. She verified every claim against the post-repair readings. They were correct. The load distribution, the secondary draw pattern, the 8-month behavioral adaptation of the grid to the primary failure, all of it was in the narration, translated into the language of you and I'm going to hand here. She wrote in her log, "Webb's narration is not communication. It is thought made audible. It is, if parsed as technical language rather than personal address, a diagnostic methodology I have not encountered in any literature and cannot reproduce and verified today against instrument readings to 97% accuracy. This is the most alien engineering document I have ever encountered. It is also correct." She looked at the word alien. She saved the log. She began, carefully, to think about what she was documenting and what it meant that she was only now beginning to document it. Day 8. The grid. Marcus had been working toward it from the beginning, she understood now. Every repair had been establishing conditions, settling the surrounding systems, giving the grid room to stabilize after intervention. He had explained this to her on day 7 in terms that she had not found in the Salathi engineering manual, and that were also exactly right. You can't address the source while everything around it is pulling in different directions. You have to settle the environment before you can settle the thing. Her full team was present. The engine room had, over 8 days, reconfigured itself around the repair work, not formally, not by assignment, but by the gravitational pull of a problem that was finally moving. Engineers drifting toward whatever Marcus was working on in the way that people move toward warmth. They were good engineers. They had been very good engineers in a crisis that had not required what they were good at, which was different and harder than simply being bad at something. The repair took 11 hours. Marcus worked with a neck on his left and Quelanath on his right, and 4 hours in, he said, without looking up, "Q, put your hands on the coupling, the secondary bypass, just above the junction, and tell me what you feel." She did. She felt the compensatory rhythm, different from junction 7's, higher frequency, a different kind of adaptation to a different kind of pressure. She told him. Her vocabulary was wrong in the terms. She did not have the right words for what she was describing, because the right words did not exist in the Salafi engineering literature, but the underlying data was accurate, and she knew it was accurate, and she gave it to him in the language she had. He nodded. He adjusted something. The adjustment was, in the instrument readings that appeared 3 seconds later, exactly correct. Something in her chest, not an instrument, not a model, recognized what had just happened. She had contributed to a repair she could not have designed. Her data had gone into it, her hands on the coupling, her perception of a behavioral pattern she had learned to read from 4 days of watching him put his hands on things. The knowledge had gone both ways and the repair had used both, and the grid was, she checked the readings, checked them again, stabilizing. Her filaments rose. She was aware of this at the same moment that she was aware she was not going to pull them down, not because she had stopped caring about professional composure, but because the composure would have been wrong in this moment, would have been a kind of dishonesty about what was happening. And she had, over 3 years of crisis and 8 days of Marcus Webb, come to the end of her ability to be dishonest about what was happening. She pulled them down anyway. She was a professional. Marcus, who had turned back to the grid, said nothing. She knew from 8 days of watching him notice things that he had noticed. Day 9. The critical systems were stable. Not repaired. The Meridian had months of standard maintenance ahead, but the cascade was broken. The failure backlog was shrinking. The ship was going to make it to port, which was a sentence she had not been able to construct without qualification for 3 years, and which she constructed now and held briefly, without reaching for the caveats. Marcus was sitting on the engine room floor. She had stopped noting his preference for contact with the physical structure of whatever he was working on. It was simply how he was eating something from his bag and drinking from a cup of sutka he had collected from the galley on the way in. She sat next to him. She had been composing the question for 7 days. "How did you know it would work?" she said. He thought about it. He was one of the few people she had worked with who thought about a question before answering it rather than producing the first answer and working backward. "I didn't know. I thought it would." What is the difference? Knowing is what you get after. Thinking it will work is what you have before. You need something to work on. She was quiet. The instruments around them made the sounds instruments make in a stable engine room, which was a different quality from the sounds of the last 3 years, and she had not had time to notice that until now. "My training says to act on what you know." "Mine too, mostly." He drank his sevka. "But there's a class of problem where what you know isn't enough. You have to make a decision with what you think, and then what you do is get as good as you can at knowing the difference between what you actually think and what you're afraid of or what you want." He was quiet for a moment. "You already know this." She looked at him. "The distress beacon," he said. She said nothing. "You didn't know that was going to work," he said. "You thought it might. You made the call with what you had." He paused. "On a ship with 4,000 people and a professional culture that treats asking for help like a character failing, that was a hell of a call." "It worked," she said. "Yeah," he said. She looked at the grid, the primary coupling interface, the secondary bypass junction, the tertiary distribution nodes, and she understood, sitting on the floor of her engine room next to a man who had spent 8 days talking to her ship, that the distress beacon and the junction repair and the narration and the hand on the housing were, in their deepest structure, the same kind of thing, the same class of decision, made with what you had before you had the answer, because the alternative was doing nothing while the ship died. She had been making those decisions for 3 years and had not had a name for them. "Your method," she said. "I've been trying to document it." He looked at her, the assessing look she recognized now. "Have you?" "From day 3. Your narration. I transcribed 40 minutes of it on day 6. I've been cross-referencing your diagnostic predictions against the post-repair instrument readings. She paused. The accuracy rate is 97%. A silence. You've been doing that since day 3, he said. I'm an engineer, she said. There was something to document. He laughed. A short, genuine sound, not at her expense but at the situation. The specific comedy of having been carefully studied without knowing it. Fair enough, he said. Is it useful? It's the beginning of something useful, she said. I don't yet know what to do with it, but I intend to find out. Day 10. Marcus was leaving. He had another contract, a cargo hauler with a failing pressure system on the Varthus run, which he described as straightforward and which Quelanath assessed, based on the information she now had about how Marcus Webb described things, as moderately complex and mildly dangerous. She presented him with the boot. The fabrication system had, at her second request, produced a pair matching, by specification, his original right boot, though the material was Sulathi composite, and the fastening mechanism was an adaptation that bore a family resemblance to his original fastener in the way that a careful translation bore a family resemblance to the original. He held them both and looked at them. They look, he said, like something a very intelligent alien made after having a boot described to it by someone who had heard about boots but hadn't seen one. That is exactly what they are. He put them on. He stood. He took a few steps, assessing. I'll wear them, he said, which was everything it was possible to say about the boots, and which was, she understood, also a statement about something else. Thank you, Marcus. She had decided 2 days ago that she was going to say this, the personal name, without the professional title, which was not the Sulathi form for a professional context and which was nonetheless the right form for this one. It cost her something small to say it. She had decided the small cost was appropriate. He picked up his duffel. He looked at her for a moment in the way that contained 8 days of working alongside someone in a crisis, which was a look that did not have a clean category. The log, she said. I would like to send it to you. Why? Because there is knowledge in it that you gave me and I don't want to lose it, and I think some of it may be useful to you articulated in a different form, a form you can reference that doesn't depend on the experience of the room. He considered this. Yeah, he said. Okay, send it. He looked back at the engine room. You should write it up. What you found about the junction rhythm, the compensatory behavior, that's real engineering. It needs to be in the literature. It will be difficult to present in the standard format. Present it anyway. He said it in the voice of someone who had, at some point in 33 years, stopped caring about format when the thing was true. Make them deal with it. He left. She stood at the docking port and listened to the seal close, and then stood for a moment in the corridor, which was a corridor on a ship that was going to make it to port, in the silence of a stable engine room, with the specific quality of presence that remains in a place where something has been happening and is now stopped. Her iridescence, in the ambient light, was faintly visible. She did not account for it in the engineering log. The log entry for day 10 began as they all began. Date, ship status summary, systems notation. The systems summary was, for the first time in 3 years and 4 months, good news. She recorded it accurately. All critical failures resolved. 17 systems returning to operational parameters. Projected return to full function within 90 days. She recorded this, and then she kept writing. She wrote about the junction rhythm, the compensatory behavior that was not in the Sulathi engineering literature, which existed in the gap between the designed object and the object that had been through 3 years of crisis and had adapted, and was now something that the original documentation did not fully describe. She wrote about the narration and what she had understood when she transcribed it, that the external form of a diagnostic process is a diagnostic document, regardless of whether it arrives in a format the field has seen before, and that her task, the task she had been building toward without knowing it, since she wrote no current explanation on day 2, was not to validate Marcus Webb's methodology against her models but to build the translation layer between them, the part that her training equipped her to build. The bridge. She wrote about the distress beacon. She wrote that she had been afraid to examine this too closely, because to examine it was to examine the decision in full, and the decision was, I do not have the answer, and I need help. which was the thing the Salathi engineering tradition had the least infrastructure for acknowledging. But Marcus had named it on day 9, had placed it alongside the junction repair and the narration and the hand on the housing, and called it the same class of thing. And she had understood, hearing it named, that it was the same class of thing, that the wisdom to know the edge of your own expertise and call for help across it was not a failure of preparation. It was, in a crisis that had left preparation behind, the most skilled thing she had done. She reached the question. She had been reaching it for 7 days. What is the difference between expertise and wisdom, and which one saved this ship? She sat with the question. She did not answer it. It was not an answerable question today, and she had spent 3 years treating unanswerable questions as failures, and she decided, finished with that. The question was a question she was now equipped to pursue, which was a better condition than having the answer too soon and not having earned it. She opened a new document. The title came before the structure, which was not how she wrote, and she let it. Emergent Fault Interaction in Complex Interdependent Systems, a case study in non-model-based diagnostics. She wrote the abstract in the precise, measured language of her training, which was the right language for the abstract, because the abstract was the bridge, the first sentence the field would read, the hand she was extending across the gap. She drafted the acknowledgments in 15 seconds without stopping to edit, because some things do not improve with editing. The primary diagnostic methodology documented herein was developed by M. Webb, independent engineer, whose contribution to the resolution of this crisis cannot be overstated and cannot, at present, be fully explained. This paper is an attempt to begin. She saved the document. She saved the log. She dimmed the light above her desk, which she had not done at the end of a working day in 3 years because the work had not been finished, and the lights being on was a statement about that. Tonight the work was not finished, never quite finished. But the cascade was broken, and the ship was going to make it, and the paper on her screen was the beginning of something that would take years to build and would be better for that. And somewhere on a cargo hauler on the Verthis, run a man in mismatched boots was drinking something that was not coffee and listening to a ship with his hands. She went to sleep. She slept easily and completely for the first time in 3 years. The document remained open on her screen in the dark of her quarters, a title, an abstract, an acknowledgement, and beneath them a blinking cursor waiting at the beginning of the first section, the place where she would begin to put into the literature the things the literature did not have, in the format the field could receive, so that the next engineer on the next ship with the next unanswerable problem would have one more tool, and the next one after that, and the one after that. The ship sailed on through the dark between stars, all 17 critical systems nominal, 90 days from port, carrying 4,000 people who were going to arrive.